Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to ask everyone to take their seats. We're about to get started. Thank you for making the effort to join us today on this very important topic. I am Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, and I'd like to welcome all of you in the room and all of you who are joining us online to today's event on FDA's new regulatory framework for tobacco and nicotine, the focus on the role of medicinal nicotine. We are very pleased that you all are here to join us for what I think is an extremely important public health discussion. I'm going to turn this event over to our keynote speaker, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, in just a minute. But as background for today, as many of you know, smoking is combustible tobacco use remains the leading cause of preventable mortality in the United States, accounting for more than 480,000 deaths per year. And that is related to the fact that about 1 in 6 adults currently continues to smoke, despite a huge amount of effort in recent decades to address tobacco use and provide safer alternatives. Addressing this epidemic, for that reason, remains one of the most important public health priorities of the 21st century. And the FDA plays a central role in addressing this epidemic through tobacco control and prevention of combustible tobacco product use. Since the passage of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act of 2009, the agency has had the authority to regulate the manufacturing, distribution, and marketing of tobacco products, to educate the public about tobacco products and the dangers of their use, and also to regulate the use of other nicotine products. As part of this authority, FDA has taken a range of steps to prevent the sale of tobacco and nicotine products to children. That includes e-cigarettes, to expand the scientific basis of understanding for traditional and newer tobacco products, and to conduct a range of public education campaigns. One of the key steps in this overall effort was announcement in July by Dr. Gottlieb of a new comprehensive regulatory plan and framework aimed at further reduction of tobacco-related harm and death in the United States. The plan has 2 key components. The first is reducing the level of nicotine in combustible cigarettes and other tobacco products that are to levels that minimize or eliminate their addictiveness. And the second component is encouraging the development and broader use of innovative nicotine-containing products that can help more smokers stop smoking and to help those who are either unable or unwilling to quit nicotine use. This new U.S. regulatory framework adds to a broad set of public health efforts to try to reduce tobacco use and harm at the federal, state, and local levels. Taken together, I think we're entering a new era with the potential to transform the tobacco marketplace and to prevent many thousands of deaths annually in the United States alone. A core component of the FDA's approach is the recognition that nicotine-containing products fall along a spectrum of risk, with combustible cigarettes being perhaps the most harmful way of satisfying a craving for nicotine. But nicotine replacement therapies, such as skin patches, gum, lozenges, are considered to be safe enough to be sold over the counter as smoking cessation aids. And as the FDA moves forward with implementing its new framework, it needs to consider a wide range of issues with regard to medicinal nicotine products. That is, these nicotine products that carry a claim of being able to help people quit using combustible tobacco products and get to better health as a result. FDA also has some challenges ahead in terms of encouraging the development of innovative new therapies that can help people quit smoking, minimize the risk of relapse, and think about how all of the emerging e-cigarette and alternative nicotine delivery products that do not involve combustible tobacco fit into this overall framework. In recognition of these outstanding agency-wide issues, one involve both the Tobacco Center and the Drug Center at FDA, last month FDA announced the creation of a nicotine steering committee with the goal of evaluating and modernizing FDA's approach to nicotine replacement therapy products. It has important areas of focus, which I think Dr. Gottlieb might elaborate on in just a minute, which brings us to today's meeting. Today, we want to tackle some of these issues and help to identify promising near-term steps that FDA, as well as other stakeholders, can take to move these efforts forward. This is not the only event or activity related to this very important set of public health and medical and nicotine delivery innovation issues. There is a Part 15, a public hearing coming up that FDA is sponsoring in conjunction with its Nicotine Steering Committee in late January. We'll talk more about that. But this is an important set of issues to address at the intersection between innovation in medical and nicotine-containing products and the FDA's overall regulatory strategy to reduce harm from combustible tobacco products. We're going to start today with some keynote remarks from Dr. Gottlieb, then we'll move on to a panel discussion with a range of expert perspectives on how to approach these issues, and we hope that you all will participate, both those of you in the room and those of you online. If you'd like to join, ask a question, make a comment for today's event, please use the hashtag #MedNicotine to do so. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb comes with a unique set of background and perspectives for this job. He is an expert in issues related to the FDA, having spent years, including most recently as Deputy Commissioner of the FDA in his public service. He's an expert in public policy and policy analysis. He's also got extensive experience in the private sector, and I think one of his most unique characteristics, though, is the energy that he brings to the job. If success at the FDA was measured by the number of new initiatives and announcements per day, I'm pretty sure Dr. Gottlieb set a record. But the way it should be measured is by impact on the public health, and I think Scott is on track to be a truly remarkable commissioner in that regard, in no small part because of this new initiative on reducing harm from tobacco-related products. Scott, I'd like to turn this over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here today. Mark didn't mention that part of that experience at FDA was working as a senior advisor to Dr. McClellan. It was my first job in government, and so I owe a lot of my ability to continue to work in the government to that opportunity that Mark gave me. He's withholding judgment for another couple of years to decide whether or not he wants to claim credit for that or not, but I ascribe credit to him for my opportunity to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. It's an honor to be here at the Duke Margolis Center to talk about FDA's current plans for public health improvement through its tobacco regulatory policy. I think this is an ideal place to speak about tobacco policy regulation and public health, given FDA's and Duke Margolis' mutual dedication to improving health by translating evidence-based policy solutions into practice. And I also appreciate speaking here today. It's humbling to be speaking before a group led by Dr. McClellan, who's been a colleague of mine for many years. And during my experience working with him when he was FDA commissioner and I was a senior advisor to him, he really set the example, I think, for what you can accomplish from a public health standpoint in this role. And I appreciate that opportunity very much. As I speak to you today, we're approaching the 30th anniversary of the 1988 Surgeon General's report on smoking and health. We don't hear as much about this report as we do about the landmark first of its kind one that warned in 1964 about smoking's health hazards. But Surgeon General C. Everett Koop's 1988 report was likewise groundbreaking, shattering the myth that smoking was just a bad habit, and presenting the science showing that cigarettes and other forms of tobacco are addicting. The Surgeon General was confirming what was long known to the tobacco industry about the addictiveness of cigarettes. Doctors were aware of the connection as well, intuitively, from watching patients struggle to quit smoking and ultimately lose their lives after grueling battles with lung cancer and heart disease or other smoking-related illness. But it wasn't until the 1988 report that the Surgeon General made the scientific determination that these products are addictive. Today I'll talk about FDA's updated plan for tobacco regulation, which I announced in July, and which promises to save millions of lives from premature morbidity and mortality from tobacco use. In one sense, FDA's tobacco regulatory plan borrows a page from the 1988 Surgeon General's playbook with nicotine and the concept of addiction as its centerpiece. Our plan addresses addiction to combustible cigarettes and takes other steps that, together, we believe can alter the trajectory of addiction. This trajectory is otherwise expected to cause more than 17 million premature deaths in the U.S. between 2014 and the middle of this century. And while the understanding of cigarettes as being addictive has held for 30 years, the modern tobacco landscape is far different from the marketplace of 3 decades ago. In just the last few years, in fact, the market has greatly transformed, and we've seen the emergence of new products. And the science, policy, and regulatory landscape has likewise evolved. For one thing, FDA's authority to regulate tobacco, first established in 2009 under the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, gave us new authorities, and those authorities were extended by the agency under the 2016 deeming rule to cover the wide variety of current and future tobacco products. This broad authority sets the stage for FDA to encourage innovation in products that can help people quit smoking. One example of such product innovation would be improvements in the technology of nicotine replacement products, also known as NRTs. These products have tremendous potential to save lives by empowering people to quit smoking, even if they don't want to cut themselves off immediately and entirely from nicotine. It's common knowledge today that cigarettes kill, yet people continue to smoke. The tragic fact is 1 in 2 long-term smokers die prematurely from cigarette-caused disease, and tobacco remains the leading cause of preventable disease and death in the U.S., causing 480,000 premature deaths each year. Why is that? A principal reason people continue to smoke cigarettes, despite these dangers, is, in a word, nicotine. Beyond identifying cigarettes as addictive, the 1988 Surgeon General's report also pegged nicotine as a culprit addictive substance, and since then, the connection has become scientifically undeniable. Most adult smokers in the United States report that they want to quit, and in 2015, more than half made quit attempts in the last year. But nicotine, which a cigarette efficiently delivers through the lungs and to the brain in less than 10 seconds, pulls most people back like a powerful magnet. Only 7% of those in 2015 survey who made a recent quit attempt were successful. Just this morning, FDA's Center for Tobacco Products unveiled a smoking cessation education campaign called Every Try Counts, which recognizes nicotine's powerful addictive potential. The newly launched campaign is designed to encourage smokers to try to quit, even if they've tried unsuccessfully in the past. Positive messages at convenience stores and other retail outlets, as well as ads that will appear on the radio and online, will encourage smokers to try again using messages such as, every time you put out a cigarette is a chance to try quitting again. Every Try Counts focuses on combustible cigarettes, with their toxic mix of more than 7,000 chemicals delivered by inhaling smoke. Products that deliver nicotine this way are responsible for the vast majority of tobacco-related morbidity and mortality in the United States. The campaign is just one example of how FDA is currently using its regulatory authority under the 2009 Tobacco Control Act to protect Americans from tobacco's harms. And it's one action among several that FDA is taking under the comprehensive new plan that I announced in July to move smokers away from deadly combustible cigarettes. While Every Try Counts focuses on helping adult smokers quit, many of FDA's actions, including tobacco public education activities, are designed to protect the youth in this country from tobacco's dangers. Almost all adult smokers, nearly 90%, started smoking when they were 18. This is significant because we know adolescents' brains are especially susceptible to being rewired to crave more nicotine, and youth also tend to lack a full appreciation for smoking's health risks. Although we're encouraged that youth cigarette smoking has declined from years past, still each day about 2,500 youth in this country smoke their first cigarette. And teens' overall use of tobacco and nicotine has remained relatively steady in recent years, thanks to the popularity of other products such as e-cigarettes and flavored little cigars. It's already illegal under the Tobacco Control Act and the deeming regulation to sell tobacco products to minors. But FDA is taking additional steps to protect youth and young adults and will be pursuing additional enforcement actions against those who market tobacco products to kids. Promising inroads have already been made with FDA's public education campaigns, The Real Cost, Fresh Empire, and This Free Life. The first campaign of its kind, The Real Cost, seeks to educate at-risk teens about the harmful effects of tobacco use. And a recent analysis found that the campaign's cigarette prevention advertising stopped nearly 350,000 youths aged 11 to 18 from initiating smoking between 2014 and 2016. To ensure that kids understand no tobacco products safe, efforts are also underway that focus on the dangers of smokeless tobacco use, and we're expanding the real cost to specifically target youth use of e-cigarettes and other electronic nicotine delivery systems. While FDA has made considerable progress, the agency must redouble its efforts to use all available tools and resources in the pursuit of two overreaching goals: accelerate the decline in smoking that's occurred among young adults while keeping tobacco products out of kids' hands and preventing future generations from becoming addicted in the first place. Having told you about some recent and ongoing accomplishments, I'd like to provide some more detail about FDA's comprehensive new framework itself. The plan recognizes that nicotine creates and sustains addiction to cigarettes, but isn't directly responsible for the morbidity and mortality from tobacco. It's the delivery mechanism for nicotine that's more directly linked to the product's dangers. In this case, it's cigarettes, the burning of tobacco and inhalation of the resulting smoke particles that renders the products deadly. On the opposite side of the risk spectrum, the FDA has approved NRTs as safe and effective products in helping smokers quit. Based on this understanding, the agency's tobacco regulation plan focuses on minimizing addiction to the most harmful products while encouraging the industry to innovate in those products that could provide nicotine without the dire health consequences. And there's one constant to all these efforts: our actions are based on rigorous scientific and regulatory foundations. Out of the gate, FDA sees immense promise in lowering nicotine levels in combustible cigarettes to make them minimally or non-addictive. The benefits would be seen in life years gained and pain and suffering avoided, as well as in health care costs saved. This policy could prevent millions of deaths that would otherwise have occurred from the use of addictive cigarettes. The Tobacco Control Act gives FDA the authority to set a product standard limiting levels of nicotine in cigarettes. The agency's Center for Tobacco Products will be issuing an advance notice of proposed rulemaking soon, seeking input on such an approach. In parallel with this step to minimize the harms of the deadliest tobacco products, we're encouraging innovation in products capable of delivering nicotine with less harm. Importantly, FDA is bringing a more progressive perspective to medicinal nicotine products, including over-the-counter therapies such as nicotine gum and patches. FDA supports development of new and better smoking cessation drug products, especially as the agency pursues the possibility of steeply reducing the permissible levels of nicotine in cigarettes. To focus on therapeutic nicotine products for combustible tobacco product cessation, we've formed a nicotine steering committee, which includes the agency's leaders from across its different centers. The formation of this committee reflects the need to critically examine the evolving science behind FDA's evaluation of NRT safety and efficacy. Pivotal issues will include considering the types of safety and efficacy studies the agency should require and the way therapeutic nicotine products are used and labeled. FDA has scheduled a public hearing for January 26 to hear from stakeholders on the approach for FDA's evaluation of nicotine replacement therapies, and is also inviting related comments to be submitted to the FDA. The upcoming public hearing is being held to obtain input on the most current science in this area about FDA's evaluation approach from a broad group of stakeholders, including the research and medical communities, tobacco and pharmaceutical industries, and other public stakeholders. Nicotine replacement therapies, which supply controlled amounts of nicotine to ease withdrawal symptoms, are used by some smokers who are trying to quit. FDA has approved two types of prescription NRT products, a nicotine nasal spray and nicotine inhaler, and three types of over-the-counter nicotine products, the gum, the transdermal patch, and the lozenge. Most of these products have been approved for at least 20 years. The use of these approved products, while varying in their degrees of efficacy by type, is generally considered to double the likelihood of a successful quit attempt. There are also other FDA-approved non-nicotine therapeutic prescription drug agents. The formulations and routes of administration of approved NRT products have remained relatively unchanged for decades. Over this time, however, research and development and changes to the regulatory landscape have led to changes in FDA's recommendations for over-the-counter NRT labeling. Specifically, the agency recommended in 2013 that 2 statements be removed from these products' labeling as no longer necessary to ensure their safe use. One statement warned consumers not to use an NRT product while smoking or using any other nicotine-containing product. The other statement advised consumers to stop using the product at the end of the labeled duration of use. Instead of the second statement, FDA recommended that consumers be advised to talk to their healthcare provider if they felt that longer use of the product would help them keep from smoking. As the body of science surrounding NRT safety and efficacy continues to grow and evolve, the agency is considering what actions could increase access to and use of FDA-approved smoking cessation products. FDA is committed to working with sponsors of NRT products, as well as any other products that can help more cigarette smokers quit, to bring innovation to the marketplace. During the January 26 public hearing, FDA welcomes feedback about the public health, scientific, regulatory, and legal considerations related to NRTs. We've posed some specific questions of interest in a Federal Register notice published on November 30th. One such question: might there be ways to improve upon current delivery systems to yield new, potentially more effective over-the-counter NRT products? Another question we put out for consideration: are there additional indications or regimens for over-the-counter NRT products that could be explored? Some have called for additional labeling revisions to state, for example, that using a longer-acting nicotine replacement therapy, such as a patch, with a faster acting form, such as a gum, is safe and likely to improve quit rates in certain circumstances. FDA is aware of literature supporting the efficacy of various combinations of NRT products, like using the patch and the gum in conjunction. With sufficient evidence in a sponsor's application, we could potentially approve a drug product with a dosing regimen combining therapeutic nicotine products. These questions and additional examples of possible feedback topics are spelled out in the November 30th Federal Register notice if you're interested in more details. Seeking public input in the form of general comments, research results, and other data and additional information is a mainstay of FDA's process for developing effective science-based approaches for public health protection. The agency is also planning to seek public input soon on various tobacco products through a rulemaking process, and I want to at least highlight some of these important additional efforts. We're planning on 3 advanced notices of proposed rulemaking, or ANPRMs. I've already discussed the ANPRM on nicotine reduction. A second advanced notice of proposed rulemaking under development will seek input on the role of flavors in tobacco product use. Issues to be considered include: what role does menthol and other flavors play in attracting youth to start using tobacco? And on the flip side, do certain flavors help adult smokers switch to potentially less harmful forms of nicotine products? A flavor might do both harm and good. FDA's regulations will be based on their net impact to public health. Another advanced notice of proposed rulemaking will seek public input on FDA's regulatory stance regarding premium cigars. Premium cigars are a topic of interest to stakeholders, with some supporting different legal and regulatory requirements for premium cigars compared to other tobacco products, including other types of cigars. FDA will seek comments and scientific input on various issues, including patterns of use of cigars and the resulting public health impacts. In a broader context, the public dialogue between FDA and its stakeholders about nicotine and tobacco regulation represents a chance to reframe the debate around harm reduction that has sometimes seemed less than constructive. In the shared public health objectives of lessening the use of the most damaging tobacco products and enabling those who need or want nicotine to get it from less harmful products, we have an opportunity to engage in an important dialogue with stakeholders to improve public health. In another step to support innovation and reduce the harms from nicotine products, FDA has revised its application deadlines for newly regulated tobacco products to August 8, 2021 for combustibles and August 8, 2022 for non-combustibles. These extensions provide extra time for FDA to explore measures for making tobacco products less toxic, appealing, and addictive, and to pursue product safety standards such as those related to accidental child exposure to nicotine. And the extensions provide manufacturers more time to prepare higher quality applications. We're using the time to get in place the rules and policies we need to make sure new products like electronic nicotine delivery systems are put through an appropriate series of regulatory gates. To make the agency's review process more efficient, predictable, and transparent, FDA plans to issue regulations outlining the information it expects in applications seeking FDA authorization to market tobacco products, namely pre-market tobacco applications, or PMTAs, modified risk tobacco product applications, and reports to demonstrate substantial equivalence. FDA is also working to finalize its guidance on how it intends to review PMTAs for electronic nicotine delivery systems, or ENDS. The steps I've outlined today are designed to work together as a package to bring FDA closer to its vision of definitively winning the battle against tobacco's deadly consequences. In fulfilling our vital consumer protection role, we must foster product innovations in e-cigarettes or other non-combustible products if they support people in leaving combustibles behind. And we must do all we can with medicinal nicotine products to help more smokers quit tobacco altogether. As smokers are helped in quitting tobacco altogether or switching to less dangerous products, health gains will begin to appear quickly. These benefits will accelerate over time as future generations of kids are far less likely to become addicted to cigarettes and suffer the long-term health consequences. In his Surgeon General's report 3 decades ago, Dr. Koop introduced the goal of a smoke-free society. Today we have the tools and the resolve and the modern multifaceted regulatory plan to make this vision a reality. As we work with public health and other stakeholders to achieve this objective, I want to end by encouraging each of you to join in FDA's public dialogue about nicotine and participate with us in finally reversing tobacco's deadly trajectory. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Gottlieb's agreed to take a few questions. So we have a microphone in the back of the room. Remember, hashtag MedNicotine for those of you who are online. I'd like to start out with one tying together 2 major themes of your commissionership. And I'm taking some credit for this as much as I can. Not that I deserve any of it. That's right. One set of issues that you're undertaking relate to new FDA authorities from the 21st Century Cures legislation, from the new User Fee Act, to take big steps in such areas as more efficient development of medical products using biomarkers or surrogate endpoints, more efficient trial designs, use of real-world evidence, communication about economic and other clinical information in some off-label cases, a wide range of activities. We've talked today about the tobacco harm reduction efforts and particularly about the role of so-called medicinal nicotine products in it. Do you see a connection between the two, or do those authorities help with developing the kinds of innovative products that you discussed in your remarks?
So I'll take it one step broader. I see, when I came into FDA, I said I couldn't imagine a better time to be leading this agency, in part because of the new opportunities we saw from technology, coupled against the new authorities and the resources the FDA got under FDARA and the 21st Century Cures Act. And I firmly believe that. And I think what I see right now at this moment in time is a lot of areas of technology that are undergoing a fundamental transformation where we are really writing the rules of the road right now with respect to how we're going to allow those technologies to continue to evolve in ways that help human health. And I think tobacco is similar. I think tobacco is at an inflection point between the confluence of these new authorities that we got under the Tobacco Control Act, which really are just beginning to get implemented, coupled with the opportunities that we see from new technology in this space. And so I see this across FDA's regulatory portfolio, and what we've tried to do is think about how to fashion a regulatory framework that is properly applied to the technology that we're seeing. So with regenerative medicine, we've tried to imagine a framework that we've articulated in a series of 4 guidance documents, recognizing that a lot of these technologies are being developed by small academic institutions. And so we've created for the first time the ability for academic researchers to band together and pool their data to file a common application so long as they follow a common manufacturing protocol and get individual site licenses. With digital health, we recognize that these products undergo rapid iteration, and so you can't file a 510K supplement every time you want to advance a digital health product. So we've taken a firm-based approach where we're regulating the developer rather than regulating the product. And so long as they follow good SOPs and we've validated their underlying software architecture, they can go to market with adaptations to their software without coming back in front of the FDA. I think with respect to tobacco, I see the same opportunity. I think what we've tried to do with what we announced in July is fashion a modern regulatory framework built off of the authorities we had in the Tobacco Control Act to both realize the goal that we set out to achieve from a public health standpoint, as well as accommodate the new opportunities which are from these new technologies.
So it sounds like a very comprehensive approach coming, but a good deal of work ahead. You also emphasize in your remarks and really throughout this FDA-led effort around getting to a smoke-free society, as you mentioned Dr. Koop earlier, you've emphasized public education. You talked about the announcements this morning on Every Try Counts. You've talked about the efforts around teen education, around both tobacco products and e-cigs. Wondering if you could say a little bit more about what we're focusing on today, the role of medicinal products. I'm not sure that's what the public's really thinking about when they think about this future that has much less harm reduction related to tobacco. Is there education efforts needed there, or what's your sense of public understanding of this part of the overall effort?
I think as we evolve these products, we're going to have opportunities to educate providers and the public about what some of the new opportunities are from these products, and as we continue to evolve the science of how to properly use these products. What we're saying is that at the very time that we're looking to regulate nicotine and combustible cigarettes to render them minimally non-addictive, we need to provide opportunities for smokers who still want to get access to satisfying levels of nicotine through non-combustible means, and try to migrate people off of the most harmful products onto products that can deliver nicotine more safely. I think when we announced this, the presumption was that was a nod towards electronic nicotine delivery systems, and I think we certainly see that as an opportunity as those products get put through appropriate regulatory gates as a potential opportunity for getting access to nicotine for adults who still want to access nicotine. But in July, we also talked about the opportunity for medicinal products, and this is really the third leg of the stool, if you will, from my standpoint, trying to find ways to create a regulatory framework that's going to allow more product innovation in this environment so that smokers have more options and more effective options to quit, and also try to look at how we can create a regulatory framework that maybe allows some of the products that currently are regulated as tobacco products that might want to come through the new drug approval process to be able to have the opportunity to make a different set of claims to do that, including potentially an e-cigarette. There are opportunities and possibilities that some of those products could come through an NDA process and be marketed as a new drug, and even in an OTC form, and be able to make a broader set of claims around smoking cessation.
And you've emphasized as a key part of this initiative the notion of spectrum of risk in terms of nicotine-containing products with cigarettes, other combustible tobacco forms at the one end, and potentially these medicinal products, at least the ones that are approved now, at the other end, focusing on cessation. Does the public get that spectrum of risk related to nicotine-containing products? Do you think there's going to be a response to people seeing maybe a broader range of claims related to harm reduction coming out of this medicinal nicotine initiative?
Yeah, I mean, this was really an attempt to make the addictive products less harmful and make sure that the harmful products are no longer addictive. And so, I think that we're trying to look at, as you said, the spectrum of risk. I think that the issue of risk reduction has historically been a challenging concept for FDA. Talking about, and this is sort of historical, I'm not talking about modern day FDA, but talking about gradations of risk, but still allowing some risk as a component of the regulatory process and acknowledging that you're still introducing some risk potentially without benefit is a challenging concept for a public health agency. But I think that the framework that we have under the Tobacco Control Act gives us a clear opportunity to embrace that kind of a framework. And I think that once we do it here and we sort of rationalize this from a public health standpoint, there could be opportunities to apply the same kind of concepts to other areas of public health across FDA's portfolio, where you might have an opportunity to move people down a risk spectrum in other areas, including areas of addiction.
Interesting. And again, we do have time for maybe one or two more questions. I know this is not a shy group. Yeah, please go to the microphone. While you're headed that way, you've outlined this comprehensive vision. You've outlined a pathway to get there. So starting with ANPRMs, ending with this new regulatory framework, updated based on all of the processes underway at FDA and for public input by 2021 for the nicotine-containing tobacco products and 2022 for the others. Any steps between those, between the ANPRM and getting that goal in 2021, 2022 that you really want to highlight, that you're kind of looking for as indications that we're well on our way and staying on track?
Well, I think we are well on our way and staying on track, even though it's early days. I mean, as many of you know, the ANPRM's displayed in ROCUS about 2 weeks ago, so they're up with OMB for review, and we're working through that process very constructively with our colleagues. I think there's going to be a lot of data points along the way to track our progress, including the rulemaking. You know, what we want to do is put in place the foundational rules to really make this a robust program, and those are the SC rule and the PMTA rule, and all the rules on which we're going to lay out the parameters in which we're going to properly regulate these products, including the electronic nicotine delivery system. So that rulemaking process is going to be public, and there'll be a lot of data points along the way.
You guys are going to be busy. So 2 last questions here. Please go ahead.
Great. Hi.
And now let us know who you are when you ask them the question.
You bet. Cliff Douglas. I'm a Vice President for Tobacco Control with the American Cancer Society. I just wanted to start by thanking you for taking this progressive, modern approach to dealing with the spectrum of nicotine products. It stands to bear a lot of fruit, and it's an important shift, so thank you for that. I just wanted to ask you a quick question about the reduction of nicotine in cigarettes. We know that as Bill Dunn, who was with Philip Morris back in the 70s, said, without nicotine there is no smoking, and that really underlines the approach that you're taking. Just wanted to ask you about the distinction between minimally and non-addictive cigarettes. We know that the cigarette companies can remove all nicotine if they choose to, and they have done that in the past with an experimental cigarette called Next in the late 80s. What is the thinking behind talking about reducing nicotine to minimal or non-addictive as opposed to simply non-addictive levels?
I think that the rationale in terms of how we talk about this is not to prejudge the rulemaking process. I mean, I think that there's a lot of science out there, and you're certainly steeped in it in your organization, that identifies where the threshold level is of addiction in terms of nicotine levels. And so we understand that science. But I think the purpose of the ANPRM and going through a rulemaking process is to gather that information from the public and make sure it's put out for public scrutiny and validated. And so I don't want to preemptively define what that level would be, how companies would go about extracting the nicotine from cigarettes, where we would ultimately end up in a regulation about what the nicotine level itself would be. So that's the reason why we talk about it in a little bit more general terms.
Thanks, Mr. Gottlieb. Name is Ryan Hamilton, co-founder of Life of Dad, social network and entertainment destination for fathers. I also have a question about very low nicotine tobaccos. It seems, kind of an instrumental part of the new FDA framework seems to be, kind of nicotine reduction in combustibles. We're seeing companies like Altria talk about reduced nicotine tobaccos in their cigarettes in preparation of such mandates. And we're also seeing, technologies like, 22nd Century Group, which Hatsukami recently, kind of shared in her research. Can you speak a little bit about, and you mentioned, we're not going to talk about, specific levels of nicotine in combustibles, but can you speak a little bit about, kind of the compliance and or pushback that you're getting from big tobacco companies in relation to some of these proposed mandates?
Yeah, I'll let Mitch Zeller, the head of Tobacco Center, comment on it also about the panel. But we've had constructive dialogue with everyone that we've engaged with. We haven't had direct dialogue. I haven't had direct dialogue yet with any of the tobacco manufacturers, but we've had some input in terms of some letters that were sent, and I see some comments that have been made in the press. And so I haven't seen anything that I would quantify or qualify as pushback yet. I think people are, and I think appropriately so, looking for the opportunity to engage with us and have a public dialogue about what we've put out. I'll be taking meetings with stakeholders starting probably next month. We have a list of about 10 stakeholders that have requested meetings with me, including tobacco companies, including trade associations, and including public health groups that have long-standing vested interest in tobacco control. And I'll start to take those meetings. I think if we're going to be engaging in a very comprehensive process here to try to undertake some very, challenging and serious policy making, we need to hear directly from people who are affected by those policies, and I'm going to take the opportunity to do that. So I'll have a better perspective to answer your question probably in about 2 months, but everything I've seen publicly so far, I'm sure, yeah, well, exactly, it might evolve over time, but everything I've heard so far is that people are willing to engage with us on this.
All right. I can say that as FDA Commissioner, your schedule is very busy, but I can also say that there's never been an FDA Commissioner with a broader set of responsibilities and activities than yours. I know you've got to move on, but I want to thank you for joining us today. It's still early on in the Gottlieb tenure, but I have no doubt that you're going to be remembered for a lot of things, probably none bigger than this one. Scott, thanks for joining us today. All right. And I'd like to ask our panelists to come on up while I introduce them briefly. Come on. We're going to be joined by Mitch Zeller, the director of the Center for Tobacco Products at the FDA, who's very closely involved in many of the initiatives that Scott just described. Dorothy Hatsukami, the Forster Family Chair in Cancer Prevention and Associate Director of the Cancer Prevention and Control Center at the University of Minnesota, and a professor of psychiatry there as well. Mike Steinberg, professor of medicine in the Division of General Internal Medicine at the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School at Rutgers and the State University of New Jersey. He's also the chief of the Division of General Internal Medicine at the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School and the director of the Tobacco Dependence Program. Denny Hennigan is the director of the Legal and Regulatory Affairs Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. And Frank Leone is at the Department of Medicine and Pulmonary Allergy and Critical Care at Penn Presbyterian Medical Center, Associate Professor of Medicine and Director of Comprehensive Smoking Treatment Programs there, also a Senior Fellow at the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics, and Fred Saunders is Medical Affairs Principal Scientist at GlaxoSmithKline Consumer Healthcare, involved in some of the current over-the-counter nicotine replacement products on the market. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like you to start maybe just with very brief introduction. So I read the bio, but can you say a little bit for our audience here and online about what you're doing related to the issues that we're talking about today in terms of care for patients, in terms of research, in terms of advocacy? Just a few sentences of quick introduction before we get going. Start on us in with, please go ahead.
Yeah. Frank Leone, I'm a pulmonologist, but I spend 100% of my time treating tobacco dependence, and I would say 50% of that time is in the clinical realm, trying to find methods and mechanisms for improving the efficiency of care, getting more people in and engaged with care, making that care more effective. And then the other 50% of the time is really dedicated to research projects, looking at new and innovative ways of applying care. We're also interested in understanding the way clinical people think about tobacco and how that may translate into opportunities or obstacles for moving forward.
And I'm Denny Hennigan with the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. And I first of all want to thank the Duke Margolis Center for inviting us to participate in this very, very esteemed panel. We come at this issue as an advocacy organization, and we and our public health partners have a fairly long history advocating for more effective, more usable cessation products that can help smokers quit, and realizing how difficult it is for smokers to quit and how important this is as part of an overall tobacco control strategy. We are, I think it's fair to say, quite excited about Commissioner Gottlieb's vision, quite excited about the prospect of non-addictive cigarettes, and we do regard this effort to revisit the whole issue of nicotine replacement therapy products and the need for greater innovation in that area as a key part of this vision, and we want to help FDA get across the finish line as best we can.
I'm Fred Saunders. I work at GlaxoSmithKline in the Medical Affairs Department. I primarily am responsible for submissions of NDAs for products to help individuals stop smoking. The other part as well is the behavioral support, which I will talk about later on. But these are very exciting times, right? So I'm very happy to be part of this. And again, I wanted to thank Duke University, Elizabeth, and Dr. McClellan as well for the invite.
My name is Mike Steinberg. So I'm a general internist by training. I'm a primary care physician. So I spend a lot of my time seeing firsthand the effects of tobacco use and all the tobacco-caused diseases, both in the outpatient setting and in the hospital. I also spend my time running the Rutgers Tobacco Dependence Program. So we run a face-to-face treatment program where we utilize a lot of the FDA-approved pharmacotherapies as part of a comprehensive treatment approach. And I think any opportunity to broaden the use of effective treatments and also make these less harmful products available to people who are currently using the most dangerous forms of tobacco is very important. And again, thank you for holding this forum. This is great.
I'm Dorothy Atskami, and I'm mostly a scientist. I've been doing a lot of research looking at the impact of reducing levels of nicotine content in cigarettes, and I think there's a lot of promising results showing that if you do reduce the levels of nicotine in cigarettes, you reduce smoking behavior, you reduce dependence, and you increase quit attempts, and there's no compensatory smoking behavior. One of the observations that we made is that when you do switch people to very low nicotine content cigarettes, they do try to seek other sources of nicotine, and so I think that these sources will be hopefully the less hazardous, less risky sources of nicotine, and of course the least of the products that are harmful, it would be the least harmful products would be the medicinal nicotine products. So I'm really excited about the possibility of having products that are maybe more effective and maybe used for harm reduction.
And I'm Mitch Zeller, Director of the Center for Tobacco Products at FDA, and as a policy guy, both in my time back at the agency, now almost 5 years, but for many years before that, I live in that intersection where all of these worlds collide. The law, the policy, the research, the advocacy, the politics, the communications. And where I sit now, what I see is this extraordinary public health opportunity for all sectors that care about these issues. You heard the commissioner say that the harm reduction debate that I'll speak up because I got this little issue with the mic. You heard the commissioner say that the harm reduction debate that has occurred over the last few years has sort of stalemated. The kinds of issues that we're talking about here, recognizing that there is a continuum of risk, and it comes down to not so much the drug, but the delivery mechanism, and the implications for all of that, for each of the day jobs that each of the people has on the panel, are extraordinary when we look at the opportunity to use the tools of regulation, tools of communication, tools of policy to address the leading cause of preventable disease and death. So I find this just a remarkable time in the history of public health to be gathering, to be asking these tough questions to figure out how to go forward, perhaps in a more unified way with more common ground than has existed before.
Well, again, thank you all for joining us today. And Mitch, I'd like to pick up with a question, actually I think I'll ask it to all of you as we get going on this discussion about where and how, where we can end up and how we can get there. As you said, this is an extraordinary time. You all are a group of people who have devoted your careers to reducing the harm from tobacco-related products in one way or another, which makes you both, on the one hand, I think, idealists, picking up on Mitch's and many of your other remarks, that this is an extraordinary opportunity to fulfill what Dr. Koop laid out 25 years ago, the potential for a smoke-free society. But you're also realists. You've been at this a while. You know that these changes are not easy. Could you say a little bit? I know people don't want to go out too far on a limb about the future, but what you see the potential for the use of tobacco-related products, for moving down this spectrum of harm and nicotine products, say 5-10 years from now. So after we've gotten this new regulatory framework in place, and particularly focusing on what the role of medicinal tobacco products would be. New ways of helping people quit, maybe new alternatives at a lower part of the risk spectrum for those who continue to use nicotine products. So tell me a little bit about what the role of medicinal products could be in achieving that future, and also maybe one thing that you'd like to make sure happens over the next 4 or 5 years as this whole regulatory strategy moves forward. And not to put you on the spot, but that's what you get, Frank, for being at this end of the panel.
So I'd say that one of the mistakes that I think the field made 25, 30 years ago, it's only really obvious in retrospect, is the idea of positioning medicinal nicotine as a mechanism to, quote, quit. The implication of that is that medicinal nicotine then needs to serve as a substitute for the cigarette, which is really a bar that's way too high for medicinal nicotine to be able to achieve. As a consequence, the way people think about medicinal nicotine is they say, okay, January 1st, I'm going to put the cigarettes down. I want the patch or whatever to help me get that done. And when they still struggle a little bit or experience feelings that they don't really understand, they imagine the patch to have not worked and then go back to smoking. I think that the future is going to look like a conversation where we talk about smoking as a compulsive disorder. And rather than ending the behavior, what we talk about as goals as far as the medicinal nicotine is concerned, the goal of the medicinal nicotine would be to control the compulsive disorder, put a person back in the driver's seat and able to make decisions about their behaviors in ways that they're not quite able to currently. And when we make that fundamental shift in philosophy, then the use of medicinal nicotine will be long-term. Doctors, nurses, et cetera, will see the application of medicinal nicotine as an up and down process titrated to effect over the long term rather than sort of a, quote, surgical approach. And we're going to see people using all these different products for their pharmacologic activity. So we're going to get strategies for use that are tailored to what the person in front of us really needs from us. We're going to use things coming at the problem in lots of different directions with the goal of controlling the compulsion. That's how I see things evolving over time.
I guess I would agree with that. Is it all right
to
go
you
out
can
of
go now if you want. Shake it up. Right?
I would agree with that, that people really should, physicians and even the smokers should consider it as a chronic disease, right? Not just a compulsive disease, but a chronic disease. Right. And so I think to date, it's just been so restrictive in terms of how we prescribe or recommend the use of nicotine replacement products. So, the idea of being able to, or using different types of products, combination of products, and the chronic use of products, I think will be very important.
Yeah, the public health community has a history of actually urging FDA to reassess its role with respect to medicinal nicotine along the lines that have been discussed here. And a number of these specific reforms that Dorothy has referred to were actually advocated to FDA a number of years ago.
Well, in your citizen petition, among
there were a number of
steps,
citizen petitions. They called for FDA to think seriously about combination therapies, long-term use of NRTs, strategies that would not require you to completely stop smoking, but perhaps a reduce to quit strategy, to think about changes in nicotine in the products themselves that might allow for a faster delivery of nicotine. And I think the time is right to revisit all of those issues, particularly in light of market changes since these citizen petitions were filed and addressed by FDA back in the 2012-2013 era. Now we have the emergence of e-cigarettes. We have the emergence of an entire exploding market for nicotine products that are being used largely for recreational purposes, but they're also being used by smokers with the thought that they actually will help the smokers quit, and yet there is no regulatory requirement that the manufacturers of these products actually demonstrate that they help smokers quit, and we see some adverse public health consequences from the unregulated market in e-cigarettes that need to be dealt with. The explosion in youth usage of e-cigarettes, aided and abetted by the design of these products to feature flavors, for example, that are quite appealing to kids. So we've got this whole range of public health issues raised by the emergence of e-cigarettes, and so you really do have this disconnect between the restrictions imposed on the safest kind of nicotine products on the drug side and an explosion of unregulated nicotine products on the tobacco side. And that is why it's so important that these steps are being made to coordinate an agency-wide approach to this. The appointment of this nicotine steering committee involving representatives of CEDAR, CTP, and the Commissioner's Office is a very encouraging first step towards that kind of agency-wide approach that is going to be absolutely essential.
So, Denny, building on that and the previous comments from Frank and Dorothy, looking into the future, 10 years from now, you see very little use of tobacco products and maybe a lot of use of alternative nicotine systems that have claims for harm reduction behind them?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it may very well be that these alternative products will themselves be pathways to quitting nicotine entirely. And I think that is actually the goal that we should be pursuing here. It's difficult to predict the future, but the idea that the most dangerous tobacco products would not be addictive and that there would be alternatives that would allow smokers to effectively deal with the effects of stopping smoking, the cravings, the tendency to relapse, and measures that have been implemented to prevent youth from migrating towards tobacco products of any kind. That, I think, those are very important elements of the future.
Okay, I want to come back to some of these issues around claims that might be associated with cessation versus maybe alternatives to using nicotine products, this chronic disease approach that you all mentioned. So we'll get back to that. But Fred, for you, what does the future look like? What's the most important step to get there?
So I'm going to up you. I'm going to say 5 years.
Okay. That's a real optimist.
Yeah, I'm being very hopeful here. So, from my perspective, it really is, looking at the current nicotine replacement therapies we have, what could we do to make them more flexible? And the two things that really come to mind are expanded indications, right? Most notably are reduced to quit and long-term therapy. Now, NRT, as you know, is currently indicated in the U.S. as an abrupt cessation monotherapy, meaning you stop smoking on your quit day and then you start using the medication exclusively, and that's it. What these indications offer are options, right? So with RTQ, it's more of a gradual type of, the way I put it, sort of easing into a cold pool, right? One body part at a time. You're sort of smoking, you're using the product at the same time, eventually going over to a full-out monotherapy quit. Now, with combination therapy, obviously, what you tend to see most often is the patch for the background cravings and an oral form for breakthrough cravings. Now, typically, for the approvals of these indications, it's a full-blown clinical program. What I'd like to have the agency consider, and those in the room as well, is we have at our disposal years of post-marketing experience. So you look at the rest of the world, you already have these indications out there, right? So what can we do to leverage the information that's out there as far as the support for these indications in the U.S.? That's what I think would be a relatively straightforward win, fingers crossed, and I think it would make a positive impact on public health. I really do.
Okay, and Mike?
Yeah, so not being a policy person myself, I don't know what the limitations of the FDA would be in these areas, but if I think about...
Oh, we're going to get to Mitch next. So.
I'm sure. When I think about the next 5 to 10 years as somebody who treats people on a daily basis, and I think about what the barriers are to what we have at our disposal, I think if we could address maybe three main things that I kind of think of as 3 A's. So the awareness of these products and the people that I see every day, there's a lot of misperceptions about the current products in terms of the relative risk of nicotine, medicinal nicotine, and honestly a lack of awareness of the benefits. So as we've heard, the doubling of success rates in our practice using combinations and longer durations, even tripling of success. So I think making the public aware of both the benefits and the relative risks, the low risks of these products is really important. Second would be the appeal. So I think over the next 5 to 10 years, improving the appeal of the medicinal nicotine products to the consumer, delivering higher doses of nicotine more rapidly, making them appealing in terms of flavors and modalities of delivery, is very important. And then there's the psychological appeal. So the image, we did a small study comparing. We gave people, this was before e-cigarettes were widely distributed, we gave people who had never used either e-cigarettes or the nicotine inhaler each product to use for 3 days. And it turned out 75% of the people who used the e-cigarette said they would use that to help them quit smoking, and only 25% of people who used the inhaler. And the overwhelming advantage was the appeal. These are products that were appealing to people. And I think we can make our medicinal nicotine products more appealing moving forward. And then I guess finally is the access. And under access, I think of things like not only increased indications and using things like combinations and extended durations. We have so many. We see so many people who we successfully use combinations of medicinal nicotine. We use clinical endpoints. We don't say, okay, you can only use these for 12 weeks, then stop. If people are doing well, they use less of them. If people are struggling, they use more of them. Kind of a common sense approach. Improving the access in terms of availability, I think considering whether the 2 prescription nicotine medications should be over the counter like they are in other countries in the world. Again, I don't know what the implications are policy-wise. And just in terms of coverage, insurance coverage of these products is very important, something I deal with daily. And I think that anything we can do, when we limit durations, at the FDA level, the insurance companies say, well, we're only going to pay for a certain duration of these products. And I think getting these medicinal nicotine products in the hands of people who would most benefit from them as easy as possible is really important.
Mitch, reflections on what you heard from the rest of the panel?
Well, in thinking about whatever the time horizon is, 5 years, what have you, I think that there are more controversial aspects of what's being discussed and less controversial. And while there's some subjectivity to that, I would say that in thinking about an expanded role for therapeutic nicotine products, I think that falls on the less controversial side. And I'm not going to get into the specific policy issues, but compared to the kind of very divisive debate that's taken place for alternative nicotine delivery systems on the tobacco side, I think that there's much more common ground, much more consensus that more can and should be done on the medicinal side of the house to help more smokers quit, including figuring out a way to use that pathway for electronic nicotine delivery systems that are thinking about coming through and seeking an indication under the safety and efficacy standard. So if I was to project down the road 5 years or whatever, I would hope that there would be genuine progress in the less controversial areas. And in the more controversial areas, what I would be looking for is, given how divisive the harm reduction and e-cigarette debate has been, and given sort of like the commissioner kind of threw down the gauntlet a bit on July 28th by saying, here's an opportunity to reframe the debate, primarily around nicotine and the continuum of risk. And here's an opportunity to ask some really tough questions about nicotine, including potentially long-term or permanent use for those who need it of less harmful forms of nicotine delivery. So one thing that I would be looking for, I hope it wouldn't be 5 years, I hope it would be a shorter number of years where we could see that progress is being made on a sustained national dialogue addressing these issues. I'm not saying that we have to have answers and consensus, because some of these questions are tough, but what the agency is saying is sort of join us in this new opportunity to reframe the national dialogue and the national discussion around this. And I would hope in way less than 5 years we would see how collectively we either succeeded or failed in creating a sustained national discussion on all of these issues. Because for the more controversial parts of this, it's going to take more time to achieve common ground, even if it's common ground just on an articulation of principles.
Yeah, well, thanks to what FDA has been doing, I think we're well on our way to that national dialogue. I think it's a really important point. I'd like to come back to that before the end. But to pick up on how to get from where we are now to 5 years or so, when Mitch sounds like they may need to rename your center at that point if there's not that much use of tobacco, part of the Center for Alternative Nicotine Delivery or something like that. To get from here to there, we've highlighted some of the ways in which medicinal products can play a big role. Maybe, Mitch, I could stick with you for a moment on making sure that people understand the differences between the authorities and legislative structure backing the Tobacco Center and the authorities and structure backing the Drug Center's evaluation of claims. So the former clearly has a focus on public health improvement and a regulatory structure for all tobacco products, and as Dr. Gottlieb talked about, a regulatory structure coming for e-cigs and other alternatives. At the Drug Center, it really is, though, about individual product manufacturers bringing a claim to the center based on scientific evidence of safety and effectiveness compared to some alternative, a placebo, an alternative treatment. So that's a different kind of approach, and that was something, Denny, that FDA highlighted in its response to your citizens' petition, that they needed claims coming in. Now, I want to talk about how to address the scientific foundation for those claims, and as you all have emphasized, but maybe you could say a few words about these differences in authorities and how the new nicotine steering committee is aiming to put all this together in a coherent way.
Well, very briefly, there are similarities and there are differences. One of the similarities is, because fundamentally what we're talking about are claims. The similarity is pre-market review of claims, whether it's under the safety and efficacy standard on the CEDAR or CDRH side of the house for a therapeutic or medicinal indication, or on the tobacco side of the house under the appropriate for the protection of the public health standard. It's still pre-market review. The difference is in the type of claims. For so-called modified risk tobacco product claims that CTP is responsible for, these aren't therapeutic claims. These aren't cessation claims. They generally fall into two buckets, either claims to reduce exposure compared to some other product, or claims to reduce risk. Now, the public health objective ultimately aligns from both sides of the house. This is ultimately about helping smokers quit and reducing the overall harm caused by tobacco use in the United States. But there are differences because one center is responsible for a medicinal claim and we are responsible for these exposure or risk reduction claims. One of the other differences is Congress wrote the modified risk tobacco product provisions in a way to instill much greater transparency and much greater public participation in the MRTP review process than you typically see for CEDAR's review of an NDA. Two ways in which that difference is manifested. First, for any MRTP application that we accept for the full-fledged scientific review, by filing it for review, the law then requires us to make the entire application available for the public to see, just subject to redactions for commercially confidential information. The other legal difference is any one of these applications that we accept for filing and review must be taken to the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee in a very public setting. And in fact, for the so-called heat not burn applications filed by Philip Morris International, we have announced that the TPSAC, that's the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee meeting, will be meeting on January 24th and January 25th, just days leading up to the Part 15 hearing on medicinal nicotine products. The standard is different. Aspects of the review process are different, but the principle of pre-market review is the same. What the commissioner is committed to is, in the spirit of trying to take a comprehensive look at this as nicotine and the continuum of risk, is this is an agency-wide undertaking. We're here today to talk more about, on the medicinal side of the house, what you all think can and should be done to make the maximum use out of those products or new products coming through that pathway to help more smokers quit on the drug side of the house. But the brain doesn't distinguish from where the nicotine is coming from. What's going on is the receptors in the brain have been rewired, and the brain is basically seeking the next dose. The brain doesn't know from regulations. The brain doesn't know from CTP. It's just looking for its next dose of nicotine, and there's any variety of ways that nicotine can be delivered to the brain. Some ways faster, some ways slower, some ways with incredible amounts of risk attached to it, some with much less, at least at the individual level, much less risk attached. And we all need to roll up our sleeves and figure this out as fundamentally a question of nicotine policy. And then delivery mechanisms and approaches to harm reduction hopefully can be baked into a comprehensive approach to the drug itself.
All right, really appreciate you all setting the stage. I'm going to ask a few follow-up questions and push on this discussion about claims for harm reduction and cessation and the like. But I want you to keep in mind that we're going to have some time for questions from people who are in the room. And remember, for those of you who are online, hashtag MedNicotine for your comments and questions. Let's start with claims related to cessation. So there are over-the-counter products on the market now with those claims in place. Several of you emphasized that there could perhaps be significant better opportunities for claims related to cessation, and maybe if you don't mind me picking on you, Denny, maybe you and Mike, what would be the evidence-based steps to broaden out cessation claims and get more innovative products on the market related to cessation of both smoking and perhaps nicotine use altogether?
Well, I think it is. It's all going to depend on the science. And when FDA ruled on the citizen petition several years ago, it found that the science was insufficient to support different indications, additional indications, such as long-term use of NRTs, such as combination use of NRTs, reduced to quit. And so,
just to be clear, we're talking about cessation of combustible tobacco products, not necessarily cessation of use of these alternatives.
That's correct, although the whole, the indication, I mean, the whole goal of this is to give the smoker a tool to deal with the reactions, the mental and physical reactions to stopping smoking that are barriers to completing cessation of smoking. So in that sense, they're all intended to relate to cessation of smoking. But there was evidence at the time, I understand, that many smokers had successfully used these products over time without the time limitations imposed by FDA, that many smokers had successfully used various combinations of these products. And I guess our view is that the time has come for reevaluation of that science because particularly in light of the emergence of this alternative realm of nicotine products, which, as Mitch said, has given rise to much greater controversy than the whole question of expanded use of NRTs. But from our perspective, there is a relationship between the less controversial and the more controversial issues here. Because the more we have this exploding, unregulated market in these alternative nicotine products, the more difficult it's going to be to get smokers to use the products that have been found safe and effective. And I think the more there is an imperative for FDA to revisit the restrictions on NRTs. In fact, one could make the argument that one of the factors that led to the rise of the e-cigarette market were the undue restrictions placed by FDA on the products that they had found safe and effective. So one of the things that makes this difficult is that it is difficult to completely focus on the less controversial issues without creating a comprehensive strategy that at least attempts to resolve the more controversial issues.
Okay, I do want to turn to the more controversial issues too, but Mike, I know your background in this is from clinical experience, but in terms of cessation claims, where do you see the best opportunities?
Yeah, I think one of the things in terms of trying to set up kind of a rule or a policy is we often err to the side of being the most restrictive. I can tell you from a day-to-day treatment standpoint, we worry about duration of treatment or we worry about combinations. The overwhelming majority of people who use medicinal nicotine use it for a finite period of time, get the benefit from it, and then stop using it. And I think what happens is for the small percentage of people who benefit from using these products for a longer period of time, they're being discouraged from doing it. They're being restricted from doing it. And it doesn't make sense to me to restrict that percentage of people who could benefit from replacing their combusted tobacco with medicinal nicotine for 6 months or 12 months or 5 years. They're going to see a benefit in terms of their health. And I think we have to think about, as we set these guidelines, are we really doing good by restricting it? Or for the 99% of people who are going to use these products for 12 weeks and then stop, they'll continue to do that. But for the people who need to use longer duration, who benefit from using combinations, we should think about kind of expanding the use.
Okay, well, I want to turn to the state of research on that long-term use and use of maybe some of these replacement products in combination with cigarettes next. But just to push on this a little bit harder, and for anybody on the panel, for the claims related to cessation, for that, you said 99%, that's a pretty high number, but for the people who are going to use these products for the short term, are there steps in terms of demonstrating cessation that the clinical studies needed to support, et cetera, that could make that process more straightforward and more attractive to a broader range of cessation products? Hard question.
Oh,
you can continue, or others too.
Yeah, I didn't want to.
And then we'll turn to the other population.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess there's a lot of as somebody who works in this from a clinical standpoint, I think there's a benefit. And I was encouraged to hear that maybe the utilization of real world data, maybe the utilization of less traditional clinical trial studies could be very helpful, because I can tell you that what happens in the real world is often a lot different than happens in a clinical trial with 10 weeks of weekly behavioral counseling and all of the structure. So I think if we can utilize some of those data, some of the real world studies, some of the clinical information that we can have from larger databases that we're actually collecting these types of information, I think the data that we have continues to show that for a certain percentage of people, there is a benefit for using longer-term medication. I think we need to be open to the types of sources we can get that information from.
And Fred, you mentioned behavioral therapies in combination, maybe some other steps. Any comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things with behavioral support, I mean, the days of giving an 8-track along with the product is it's not very useful, right? So we have to really challenge ourselves, like, what can we do? And we're actively working on this right now. What can we do to make this more engaging, right? You're in the world of technology now. You have apps, you have computers. We don't want the individual. Behavioral support is such an important fundamental when it comes to helping these products work better. We don't want the person just to take it and throw it behind them in the garbage, right? So I think really looking at computer-based modalities, looking at things like apps is really the way we should be doing it, and we could. And I think again, it can make a difference if people start paying attention to this, if people get a better understanding how to use the products too, because one of the big issues with NRT is compliance, right? People don't use it like they should. We recommend 9 pieces a day for the first 6 weeks. What do we see? We see 3 or 4. So, what can we do to get that message across? What can we do to get the message across that nicotine is not the bad guy, right? It's there, and if it's done in the right way, the right step down, it will help you quit. So these are all things that I challenge myself on and challenge the team at GSK as far as again, making the behavioral support much more engaging than the way it already is, because it is such an important part of this.
And Frank, did you have a comment too?
So I think one of the unintended benefits of CTP taking on responsibility for thinking about nicotine and its benefit at a population level is going to have everything to do with the sort of artifactual scientific method effect. What I mean by that is that if I build product X and want to figure out whether it's safe and effective, there's a structured way that I kind of look at, if I apply product X to patient Y, what is the outcome of that? And that's a very linear way of thinking about outcomes. But when you expand that point of view to populations, you start to get into different mathematical models, chaotic models, probability models, where you say a population, the members of a population group exist in 3 or 4 different states around smoking. And if I introduce product X or intervention X into that population, what's the relative change in proportions within that population of states that the members of that community exist in? And I think that actually that way of modeling the impact of interventions is going to get closer to the sort of real-world experience that Mike was talking about. There's a distance between the linear product effectiveness for a single defined outcome and a more sort of organic, probabilistic way of thinking about how we're changing the behavior of a group.
Mm-hmm. Mitch, go ahead.
Just a couple thoughts to add. I'm not going to get into the issue of what is the right measure of cessation, but just a couple of observations. This kind of discussion has not been taking place publicly. And simply the fact that we're having this discussion, that there's going to be a Part 15 hearing, that agency-wide we see these issues as being an integral part of a comprehensive approach is the beginning of a new chapter in all of this. Questions more specifically about what are the evidentiary burdens pre-market, what can be shifted to post-market, that all needs to be engaged in and discussed and debated. At the end of the day, our colleagues in CEDAR need applications to review. Indications don't get made by policy. They get made by companies filing applications, but there's a chicken and egg issue.
Yeah.
I mean, Fred is going to be very polite about this, but companies have to have a reason to believe that if they file an application, it has a chance.
Well, not only has a chance for approval, but has a market chance after, and I want to get to that in a minute.
And so the agency needs to hear from all interested parties, including the sponsors, about level of interest in submitting the applications so that drug reviewers can get down and review the science and think about the indications and think about shifting evidentiary burdens from pre to post if that becomes the right thing to do, especially if the comparator here is continued smoking.
Okay, I know there's more that we could say on this. We've got some really good points about potential directions, and we're having that discussion now, Mitch, that you were highlighting. Let me bring up a couple more issues related to this that you all have already raised. One is potential for claims related to long-term use of the products, not duration. Dr. Gottlieb mentioned that the current labels now no longer explicitly say stop using the product at the end of 30 or 90 days. Maybe it's a minority of patients, but it's certainly been a live issue, to Mike's point earlier, about whether and how claims related to long-term use should be treated. Maybe Dorothy, I know you wanted to comment, but yeah. Could you maybe add a little bit on the state of scientific evidence and whether we need more research related to long-term use of these alternative products, and also related to the potential for some smokers to continue smoking but at a lower rate while using these products? Is that safer than just continuing to smoke using these products in combination? Tell me a little bit about the state of the science that may need to be enhanced to address these kinds of claims.
So in terms of long-term use, we certainly have the Swedish experience in terms of the fact that snus use is really high in Sweden relative to smoking among the males. And because of that, what we see is we see a significant reduction in mortality, tobacco-related mortality.
So much lower
morbidity.
Use of combustible tobacco products in Sweden, and
as a
lower
result
overall
of the
mortality.
substitution with snus, essentially. And so you do see a reduction in mortality and morbidity. And so I think that's important to remember, that we do have some evidence to show that long-term use of product can potentially lead to reduced risk. So I think that's an important point. I think that long-term use, it's interesting because you might want to even reframe it a little bit and call it a harm reduction approach, right? Because I think in part what has been troubling, and this was a point that was made previously, is that many people don't realize that medicinal nicotine products are in fact less dangerous than cigarettes. And that continued use probably has minimal health consequences. So, I think it's really important to educate the smoker about the relative risk of smoking compared to these medicinal products. And one possible way is to have a modified risk tobacco claim on the product, where you can say that this product, medicinal product, is less harmful than cigarette smoking.
I don't know why she was looking at me.
Yeah.
Do we need? I know, Denny, you may have a point on this, but I just want to, before we leave this issue, about the research evidence base. Is there more research on these topics that would be useful to conduct, or are you suggesting just moving ahead with the potential for these kind of reduced harm claims?
I think that there's sufficient research to say that you can have a reduced harm claim with medicinal products compared to cigarettes. I mean, it's just a no-brainer. In terms of one of the questions that you asked is, what about reducing levels of nicotine or reducing levels of smoking as using medicinal products? And I think that that's only beneficial if it's reduced to quit, not necessarily reduced to continue smoking, essentially. I don't think there's really good evidence, especially because the slope for risk for cardiovascular disease is very steep, meaning that you can smoke a few cigarettes and still be at risk for cardiovascular.
Denny, I know you had a comment, and then I want to get to a couple more questions quickly before we open it up to the broader audience.
I just wanted to comment on an idea that both Mitch and Dorothy referred to, and that is the issue of smoking as the proper comparator. This is an issue that the public health groups raised a number of years ago, in which we felt that in evaluating the risks of NRTs, and there are some risks, those risks were not evaluated in the context of the alternative of not using those products, which is continued smoking, which is going to kill a half of those who continue to do it. And the presentation of those risks of NRTs was not effectively in the context of educating the consumer about the far greater dangers of continued smoking. So that's another issue that we think deserves to be revisited in the NRT context. Very, very important, and it kind of runs across a lot of the issues about different indications.
Well, I think it goes to my questions about the state of the scientific evidence and whether more research is needed on, to Dorothy's comment, sounds like there's not evidence that if you continue to smoke at some level and use nicotine replacement alternatives, these lower harm products at the same time, that is actually safer. So that's one area where research might be needed. Maybe there's some others that could, when CEDAR is making a comparison between using this product, using a placebo, or an alternative approach, are there proximate indicators that you could measure that would predict lower long-term risk from the harms related to lung cancer, all the other consequences of tobacco product use. So just to flag that issue of, do we need more research on any of these topics that would facilitate claims approval? But I want to go to one other topic that's come up already, which is there's an explosion of e-cig products. I defer to Frank and Mike, but for people who are trying to quit or cut back today, do they use medicinal nicotine products or e-cigs more often? What's the current state of smoking cessation efforts?
I mean, we see, I'd say in 2017, it's extremely rare to have someone come to our program who has never tried an e-cigarette to help them quit. I'd say 5 years ago, it was hard to find those folks. Now it's almost impossible to find people who haven't. Interestingly, I mean, we tend to see people, by the time they come, they've tried on their own, they've maybe tried some things over the counter on their own. By the time they come to us, we have a fairly, and I'm sure Frank also does, highly dependent, highly comorbid type of folk who's coming to us who has a lot of medical comorbidities, behavioral health comorbidities, and they're coming for treatment. And those people, honestly, the majority have not successfully quit using e-cigarettes. They've tried them, and now they're coming to us. So I think, again, it's a little off topic, but I think the people who think the e-cigarettes as we currently have them are going to be a panacea to kind of who is still left using combusted tobacco, I think we're going to find it's not going to be the case. And that speaks to the broader issue here that we need to make our medicinal nicotine products better. They need to be more appealing. They need to be more accessible in terms of delivery and things like that. So I think people are using them. They're trying them. But I think there's still a long way to go.
And you've talked about ways to make the I guess, traditional medicinal products a little bit less traditional and more attractive. But let me push on what is the role as these, let's say these claims pathways for reduced harm become clearer through CEDAR. Is there a pathway for e-cigs, for heat-not-burn products, for snus in this mechanism?
For me, the most important aspect of any of these either current products or new products that could come down the road is safety. And if we can, in my mind, demonstrating that we have a medicinal nicotine product, a nicotine delivery device that is safe, it's not just a little less harmful, but it's a safe product and someone can use it, safe within the realm of things. Obviously, as a physician, I prescribe a lot of medications that have side effects, but safe in the general sense that people can use this product and largely not suffer major consequences. That's the most important thing. I think, honestly, efficacy for cessation and all those things are secondary. If you've got a product that's safe and you put it out in the market and you let people use it and try it and have free access to it, the market will probably determine what the best products are. But I think it's our responsibility to get the products out there for people to use and make sure that they're safe.
Dorothy, Frank, any comments to add on this point?
No, I would agree with that. I think, the issue is that people are voting, smokers are voting with their feet, and they are choosing the electronic cigarettes. We even did that with one of our studies where we switched people to very low nicotine content cigarettes and gave them access to various products, and it was the electronic cigarettes that they chose, not the medicinal nicotine products. And so, I think that the whole issue of trying to make them more appealing and even have a higher abuse potential is really a good one. And not only that, but making them priced so that they're affordable, because most of the people that are having problem or who are smokers currently do have comorbid disorders and are of lower SES, and so we need to make these products affordable as well.
So I have a slightly different point of view. I feel like right now, 2017, we can't use, quote, electronic cigarettes in an organized way to help people stop smoking for two fundamental reasons. First, there's no one thing as the e-cigarette. That word represents thousands or so different products with vastly different physical characteristics in terms of what they deliver, the temperature, pH of the aerosol, that kind of stuff. All that impacts the addictive liability of the product, as well as the impact of the product, as well as the safety profile of the product. So to imagine that we can wrap our arms reliably around, quote, the e-cigarette with that degree of variation in the products themselves is too much right now. I think that will change over time, and so the potential exists to bring order to that chaos. But in 2017, that doesn't exist just yet. And the other point I would make is that there's also some degree of chaos within the patients themselves. Generally speaking, we imagine smoking to be one thing. But in fact, there are different sort of, I hate to use the word flavors, it sounds gross, but there's different flavors of smoking trajectory for people who engage in treatment. And you've seen this yourself. Some folks quit pretty easily with just a little information, some guidance. Some folks take 2 or 3 quit attempts, maybe 5 or 10. Other folks are trying for years, and no matter how sophisticated the interventions are, we can't get traction. And so I think that the reason that we're not seeing tremendous signal from e-cigarettes has to do with the application of the e-cigarette to the entire population of smokers. Whereas I think in the future, we'll get better at identifying what type of smoker this person in front of me really is and whether or not they're most likely to resonate, whether or not their problem aligns with the solutions the electronic cigarette device may be fixing.
Maybe some opportunities for targeted claims with that. And Denny's got a comment, but I do want to open this up to questions, comments from those of you who are here, so please head for the microphone for that. Denny, quick comment?
Yeah, I think that this discussion of the need to bring order into the current e-cigarette chaos cries out for regulation of e-cigarettes in a way that in which the FDA is in a position to determine whether companies have actually demonstrated that their particular products help some smokers or all smokers quit. And that's absolutely essential. So as we reevaluate the agency's approach to medicinal nicotine, it's absolutely essential that we get this wild, wild west of e-cigarettes under some semblance of control in a way that can actually inform consumers, inform smokers of the products that FDA has determined can help you quit. And there simply is no public health justification for these other e-cigarette products that are essentially serving recreational purposes and have been intentionally designed and marketed to attract kids. And yet those are the products that are dominating the current market. So this cries out for, again, an agency-wide approach that brings the e-cigarette market under some semblance of rational control at the same time we improve the availability and usage of medicinal products.
So that regulatory strategy, from Dr. Gottlieb's comments earlier, sounds like it is coming. It's based on the ANPRM, these further steps. Sounds like it's not coming fast enough for you.
It's not.
Maybe in the meantime, right, these pathways here for claims around safety to comments from Mike and others could be a help. So I do want to go to the questions. If I have time, Fred, I've got one more question for you, but please go ahead.
Jim Solis with Swedish Match, and our signature product is snus, which is made in Sweden. And follow up on Denny's statement about ends being unregulated and the controversy that may make. We are in the process of going through the MRTP process. We have had an interim decision, and now we're working on an amendment, and it's gotten a great deal of attention. But what has not perhaps gotten enough attention is that our 8 snus products in the U.S. have been awarded PMTAs. And the decision document that CTP issued...
Is this for the audience who's not familiar with
right,
PMTA? Maybe say a word
pre-market tobacco application, which has to meet the standard of appropriate for the protection of the public health. And the CTP decision document is just an excellent document because it addresses safety. It addresses why this was awarded. And I think CTP always takes opportunity to tell people, read the decision document because it's very illuminating. But I think it does demonstrate that the PMTA pathway works, that CTP has managed to identify a product based on scientific research and evidence, in this case from Sweden, to demonstrate that there are certainly alternatives that do provide a risk reduction. And I just think that that needs to be highlighted perhaps more, and given, CTP needs to be given credit for that as well.
Okay, thanks for the comment. And if Mitch, if you've got anything to add to that, does that line up with the discussion that we've been having here around harm reduction claims?
Yeah, in general, I mean, I know that there are a lot of people who are advocates for ends who will say, we'll believe it when we see it when it comes to the PMTA pathway for ends, but we have said from the beginning, based upon the authorizations that Jim referred to, that it is a viable pathway. MRTP is different because that's about claims. That's not about marketing authorization. And for the Swedish Match products, we rejected one. Sorry about this cough. We rejected one request and deferred and basically suggested the company rethink, as you've heard Jim describe, the other two. Nonetheless, we still think that MRTP remains a very viable pathway, and we will all see what happens when TPSAC meets at the end of January to convene on the latest MRTP application to be accepted for filing and review. Congress set the bar the way they did for PMTA and MRTP. We are following the law, but we encourage everybody to participate in the process.
Please.
Stacy Ehrlich with Kleinfeld, Kaplan, and Becker here in DC. Mitch, I know you've been very concerned on the tobacco side with population-level effects of innovative products, their effects on initiation and cessation. I thought it was interesting what Dr. Steinberg said about increasing the likelihood of success with medicinal nicotine products by enhancing their appeal and enhancing access to these products. At what point do we have the same concerns on the medicinal side with the population level effects? And a related question, and Mitch, you said you didn't want to deal with this, but a related question is, what does cessation mean? What are we talking about? Are we talking about smoking cessation, or are we talking about nicotine cessation? Because if we make medicinal products more appealing, more accessible, does that lead to long-term use of nicotine? And is that really a concern? Is that a problem or not?
I'm happy to take that on, Stacy. And I've been saying publicly for a while, there are tough questions that we need to ask about long-term and perhaps permanent use of any nicotine delivery. Look, smokers are on permanent use, okay? And the product is killing half of all long-term users. So we already have permanent use. Isn't working too well at a population level. There are some really tough questions that need to be asked about long-term or permanent use, about less harmful alternatives to cigarettes. And that's part of the societal debate that needs to take place. The experts on the panel want us all to understand this as a chronic condition or a chronic disease. It is. And so what role can and should, not necessarily for FDA to be the one to answer, it's for all of us to engage in and debate and discuss. What role should long-term, if not permanent, use of alternative forms of nicotine play in helping at a population level a vast number of smokers not lapse and not relapse to the most harmful form of nicotine delivery? We want to participate in that discussion, but I think that those are societal questions that you all need to engage in on. Oh, and by the way, we also need to dispel these profound misperceptions that some people have about nicotine safety. One of the barriers to uptake of NRT is that there are smokers who, for whatever reason, think that nicotine causes cancer, and they're just going to be trading one form of cancer for another. So, we can work on these issues, but unless we address the nicotine misperception issue, we will never make as much progress as we possibly can.
So I saw a lot of head nodding on the panel about that. That gets back to this education discussion, public education discussion we talked about earlier. Mike, you had a comment, and then I'd like to go to Fred next for one follow-up question.
Just very quickly, I think it was a great point you're making. Every day I treat people with, say, atrial fibrillation, with blood thinners to prevent stroke. And we do that with the whole knowledge that there's a risk of bleeding in preventing that more serious condition. And I think in that sense, as a clinician, I feel very comfortable weighing the risks and benefits of a treatment. And in my mind, I'm convinced 100% that someone who's going to continue to use combusted tobacco for the next 20 years is in much more harm's way than someone who's going to use medicinal nicotine for that same period of time. And I think we do need to consider the population level impact of initiation. I just find it hard to believe, at least in the current, with the current products, there's not a big market, people rushing off to use nicotine patches and saying this is wonderful. Maybe the products will get better and more people will be attracted to them. I think the benefit is going to outweigh those risks.
And Fred, picking right up on that comment, no offense to your nicotine patches or other products, but based on what you've heard today, do you see a pathway for companies to bring more of these claims forward? Is there a market there? Is there a future there?
Absolutely.
Or anything else that we've missed?
I think, looking forward in time with nicotine replacement therapies, I think some of the things we can do to make them more appealing, because you're right, I mean, they have to be appealing. People have got to want to use them, right? Not only for the health benefit, but because it doesn't taste gross. So I think some of the things that I think would be important moving forward, something like speed, right? And obviously, look at smoking. The nicotine reaches the brain in 11 seconds from puff to brain. It's remarkably fast. Now, NRTs are designed to be slower than that, right? That's all part of it. But can we get a little closer? And that sort of goes over to the flexibility as well, because no smoker is the same, no two quitters are the same. So you're going to, I think, in duration of use, in how it's used, I think flexibility is going to be very important. The end game is stopping smoking. You're going to have a smoker who can quit just on willpower alone, and others not so much, right? So what can we do as far as setting the stage for flexibility to help people stop smoking, knowing that the true comparison is continued smoking? You can't go back to that. That's not an option, right?
Time for one more question.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this excellent, informative presentation. I'm Jack Mitchell, and I'm with the National Center for Health Research. I know there was a question earlier about reduced nicotine levels versus non-addictive levels. I don't know what FDA or the government at large knows about what that magic number is, or allegedly is, but it seems to me that industry certainly knows what that number is, because they were found by FDA 20 years ago to be manipulating those nicotine levels deliberately. So given that, it's kind of difficult to believe that these same companies would agree to lower their nicotine level in their products near or at the level at which most of their customers will stop using their product. So if you could make any comment or clarification on that, it would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, and Mitch, Dorothy, I guess that's where regulation comes in.
Yeah, I mean, the commissioner has talked about us using a product standard authority. If we do it, it's not voluntary. If there's a final rule that specifies a maximum allowable level of nicotine in any category of tobacco products, the product can't be sold if the levels are higher. It's not a matter of voluntary. The commissioner was also asked the question about industry reaction to our July 28th announcement, and you heard him talk about that we're committed to meetings with all sectors, including industry. You also heard him talk about a general characterization of at least media accounts of industry reaction, which have mostly been neutral to positive. And we can all read into that anything that we want. The science will be our guide. It starts with an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which, as you heard the commissioner say, is now formally under review at OMB. And when it publishes, we'll share what we know, not because we've figured out the level and we're ready to propose it, but there is science that we're going to put out. But most importantly, in this first step in the process, we're going to be asking a whole bunch of questions about the level, about unintended consequences, about other issues related to compliance and enforcement. And it will be an opportunity for everybody to share with us any relevant information, because you've heard the commissioner speak publicly a number of times now. We're very serious about the potential use of this product standard authority to render cigarettes as we know them minimally or non-addictive. If the day comes that we do it, it's not going to be a question of do the regulated entities like it or not, because it will be mandatory. You won't be able to sell the product if you're not in compliance with whatever the level is.
And that kind of brings us back to where we started this discussion about what the future looks like. And Dorothy, if I could push once more, and I know this may be beyond where the science lets us go, but if and when we get to that minimally addictive or non-addictive level of combustible tobacco products, how widespread do you think the ongoing use of these alternative, reduce harm nicotine-containing products will be, especially if some of the steps we've talked about today are successful?
Yeah, so, I think that there are going to be a group of people that are going to be successful in terms of quitting using combusted products. But for the people that are heavily dependent, they are going to be seeking other sources of nicotine, and they will be the alternative nicotine products that hopefully will be regulated and scientifically shown to be less harmful than the combusted products. So I do see a substantial increase in the alternative products if we do reduce the levels of nicotine content in cigarettes. But on a population level, that should be a good thing. There's going to be less harm or less tobacco-related or nicotine-related deaths and death and disease as a result of that shift. The one concern that we do have is, how addictive will these alternative nicotine products be? And so if they are highly addictive, then you do become very concerned about the uptake among youth, and so that's a real concern. But if you do reduce the levels of nicotine content in cigarettes, it may be that you don't need a highly addictive alternative nicotine product. And so maybe that will be what we'll see in the future.
Okay. Panel has done a great job of discussing issues, both this overall FDA strategy and next steps, but particularly the role of medicinal nicotine products and forward-thinking approaches to claims, to related evidence and the like. Any final thoughts that you all would like to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'd like to start and just briefly go back to something that Stacy had in her question that I hadn't addressed, that I think she did a very nice job of sort of reducing to its bare essence, and it's the notion of tobacco-free and or nicotine-free. Mm-hmm. It's a really important question. And I kind of got at the nicotine-free part by saying these are important, tough questions for society. But that's a really nice framing of what we're talking about here. The tobacco-free part of it, I think, is the easy part. It's the
well,
nicotine.
it hasn't happened yet, but okay.
No, in terms of consensus that would be good for public health. Mm-hmm. Nicotine-free, I don't think we have. There's no consensus yet on nicotine-free. That's why the agency announced what it announced. That's why we're here talking about the role of medicinal nicotine. And it's a tough question that we need to grapple with. What if there's some subset of smokers who, in order to avoid the lapse and the relapse, need to stay on an alternative form of nicotine delivery that doesn't have tobacco in it for a very long period of time. And so, and it's not an oversimplification. So, think about tobacco-free and or nicotine-free, and I think that's a nice way of framing part of what we all need to be talking about going forward.
Mm-hmm. Any other final thoughts?
Well, one of the problems, of course, is that it's not like there's a list of those smokers who will not quit, and their only alternative will be long-term use of nicotine. If there were a list, then we could market these products directly to them without any kind of risk of unintended consequences like attracting kids. So that's the real dilemma. Yes, in theory, there probably are smokers who cannot quit, and this may be the best hope for those smokers. How do we make these products available to those smokers without adverse societal consequences?
Well, that relates back to Frank's comments about further research on targeting as well as maybe claims that are specific to subsets. So we aren't going to solve all these problems today, but I think all of you have heard that the future is going to be different. It's just a question of how quickly and effectively we can get there. This is not going to be the last word on the subject, but I will tell you that because of the importance of this public health issue, this is a topic that Duke Margolis, as a health policy program, is going to stay involved with, hopefully in collaboration with the kinds of people, with the people we've had on the stage today. It's been a great opportunity to learn and to air out ideas, and Mitch, to your point, to move forward on that science-based national dialogue around how we can achieve this transformation and reducing the #1 cause of premature death in the United States. So I'd like to thank our panelists for their thoughtful contributions to this discussion, and if you could hold your applause for just one more minute. Mitch in particular for his role in working with us in planning this event and helping make sure it fits into these very important set of issues where FDA needs input. And I guess I'll make another plug for January 25th, that Part 15 public hearing, an opportunity to lay out
I think it's the
views on this
26th.
issue. Sorry, January 26th. Thanks for the correction. And a special thanks as well to Kathleen Quinn at the FDA Office of the Commissioner, and particularly to our team at Duke Margolis, Meredith Freed, Sarah Sapsiri, and Liz Richardson for all of their efforts to put this together, and to all of you for being part of this transformational dialogue and hopefully action to address this enormous public health threat. Thank you all very much.